Hello and welcome to Redefining Success with Dream a Dream. I'm Varsha Pillai and today I'm joined with Dr. Karen H, who will introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Karen and I work at the UCL Institute of Education in London. So I do research on leadership, on gender, on equality, and I work in lots of different countries. So I've worked in about 35 countries around the world.
Wow, and we're so lucky that you're here in India.
I am so lucky.
So just tell us about, you've been touring India, you've been visiting places, you've also seen the center, you've seen the program, Dream a Dreams program as well. So how has it been, the entire thing, how has it been like so far for you?
So I think I had been a big fan of Dream a Dream's work for a very, very long time. And various people throughout the world had said to me, do you know Vishal? Do you know Vishal? So finally, I called him during the lockdown and sent him a message and said, everyone says I need to know you. Would it be okay if we have a conversation? So that turned into meeting him and Sucheta when we were in Austria. We were all Salzburg Global Fellows. And that then translated into my invitation to come. So I've actually only been here on the ground in Bangalore for about 3 or 4 days, but it seems like we've covered a lot. So I've been to a creative facilitation. I've been to facilitation here at the Thriving Center. I've had meetings with almost every part of the organization. And what's been amazing to me is consistently how passionate staff are, which will happen in many places, but how talented the staff are. So it's a combination of being incredibly committed to the children and communities you work with, but also bringing a wisdom and skill in facilitation, in addressing and helping people who are in really difficult circumstances that has happened across the entire organization. Like even saying it, I get kind of goosebumpy. It has probably been one of the most inspiring periods of time I've had. So I'm leaving even more a fan than I was when I arrived, and I was a pretty big fan when I got here.
That's awesome. So I'm really glad that you had such a fulfilling visit so far. But given the enormous amount of experience that you've had within education and the ecosystem itself, and we all know that the last 2 years were not that great for most of us across the world. But I think the youth were possibly and potentially the most impacted, right? So given the kind of, and the amount of time that you spend researching with the intersection of leadership, education and ecosystems, right? What is it that you think that is no longer working for young people?
It's a good question. And I will answer it both as an academic, but also as a mum. So I have a 12-year-old who was 9 when we went into the pandemic. And it's been really difficult. So to all of the parents that are watching, thank you and good work. I think for so many of us, there's been loss of family members, there's been challenges, and there's also the educational challenges. And I think what we can no longer do is think that a child walks in the door exactly the same as every other child. And I think for a very long time, organizations that work in education have had to work on the assumption that all children are the same when they walk in, because the challenge of educating them, if we actually acknowledge how different they are, becomes almost impossible. So for my son and his friends, one of the most difficult things is they spent a lot of time online. And as an adult who doesn't spend all her time playing PlayStation, which my bosses at UCL will be pleased to know, what I think was really interesting is how their social fabric has moved to being connected by the internet, which is the same as adults who worked. So we would be connected by Zoom all the time. So while we would talk just to each other, they would play and talk to each other. So I think the other thing, school systems need to recognize that kids need to be differentiated even better than they are now. I think everyone needs to get much better at understanding that everyone has gone through a traumatic experience. And we've done quite a lot of work with organizations and different groups to say, when people come back, and COVID isn't over, unfortunately, but when people come back, it's an opportunity to sort of come back and talk about how we're the same, but also talk about how we're different. So we developed a few tools that we would use in talks and workshops with teachers and leaders to help them understand what their experience was like. And we were calling it a pandemic privilege audit. So did you have a house that you could live in, or a rented flat? Were you living with your family? Were you living by yourself? Were you taking care of children or adults? Did you have loss? Did you have enough to eat? And for a lot of people who've done the tool, it's made them realize that while they thought their life was challenging, they had no idea that some of our colleagues who had come from China had been sort of verbally abused on the street because people were blaming them for the pandemic. So in my work, I've tried to address that notion that everyone needs to be treated with respect and treated differently by working with teachers and leaders to see how they work. And then also as a parent, trying to step back and say, okay, my kid is going to play online. That doesn't mean his life is going to be awful. Children, I think, are going to communicate in that way if they have the resources to be able to do so. But what they need is the skills to be able to treat each other with respect and kindness and to navigate that new environment, which I think is something that we haven't concentrated on as much.
So my takeaway from that is the other two values that you spoke about, which is kindness, right? And interestingly, the way the education system is designed, and internationally, right, or nationally, and ours is mostly colonial, and we're still continuing with that, right?
I'm sorry for that.
You don't have to be.
I am. Every day in my home, my son will blame me for colonialism. I'm Canadian. I was also part of a colony, but yeah, apologies.
No, the point is that none of what is there in the education system that is so seeped in and that in the end actually decides whether a young person has the potential to actually thrive is far away from these values of kindness and respect, all of that, right? So what is it that the education ecosystem needs to change to redefine the way they're looking at success itself?
I think there's two things, and I've watched this with my son as he chose his secondary school and he decided where he wanted to go. I think one is when you look at a school, often you can tell immediately. As a researcher, we don't tell. We go back and we gather the data. But I think often as a parent or as a student, you can feel if you're in an environment where people will be treated equally. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in England at the moment is that it's palpable who will be treated in a particular way and who won't. So if you are not from the majority in a particular school, or if you're perceived to be not affluent in a particular school, even though the teachers and the leaders will be trying their best, the structures of our system are established to make sure that students are stratified and that some will always do worse than others. So in terms of what we need to change, I think the core thing for me is that our leaders and teachers need to be treated in a particular way. It's really difficult if you're asking a teacher to treat a student with kindness and demonstrating what kindness looks like in Dream a Dream or in a particular district in India or in Canada or in England, unless there's a discussion about what that kindness might look like. And what I find interesting is that I grew up in a family that was incredibly kind. So there's just sort of at everywhere you turn, there's someone in my family who's there to ask if you're okay or if you need anything. So I grew up with the habit of being kind. My mom is probably the most kind, although my dad does make us breakfast in bed. So I learned what kindness felt like, and I learned to expect kindness, and I learned how to be kind. Not everyone has that growing up. So if you're asking teachers to understand how to help their students be kind or to be treated fairly, that then turns back on the teachers to be able to say, do you know what that feels like? And that's a hard question to ask. So then it becomes an issue of modeling it throughout the system, through all of your programs and all of your practices. One of the sessions that I got to go to this week was with Chundra, who was with a group of young people, boys and girls, who were, I think, about 12, 13. And I wrote him a note today to say thank you. And one of the most amazing things about being in that group, and also the older group I saw, was that as soon as I walked in, I was almost enveloped by kindness with the Dream a Dream children who'd been working. And they made space for me. They made sure I understood the language. They were giving me guidance. And what I said to Vishal and Sucheta, but I also said to Chundru and Pramila was, you've demonstrated to the children that you work with what kindness is, and how do you behave kindly, and without even thinking about it, you could see that ripple of having learned kindness be enacted right away by the kids without even a second thought. And that to me is a testament to how the model of how Dream a Dream is working, where there's an organization that believes in a particular set of values, that treats their employees in a particular way, and the facilitators work with the kids in a particular way. It was the most amazing example for me of, every CEO in the world wants their organization to be a place where people can thrive, to do good work, usually to make them money. And they struggle with finding a way to translate values into outcomes. And for me, what this week has been is watching a core set of values that should be the values for every education system translate into the behavior of every child I met. And with those fundamental sort of principles at their core, they will be able to change the world. And for me, it was the most amazing. It's just been amazing.
So exactly, that's right. I mean, in the sense of role modeling, that's what we've been doing.
Exactly.
Through the system. And
with less words, much more efficiently.
So the role modeling bit works very well, and we've seen that it works very well. And we've been doing that for the last 24 years with the huge set of young people who've been as part of our programs. But how do you role model this for a system that, and I'm coming back to, and since you've worked with education leaders, how do you do that at the leadership level, especially since you yourself have shared that it needs to be experiential?
Yeah.
So the system itself is set. So how do you break that system? Or in many ways create a new system, right?
So I think there's lots of people who, including Dream a Dream, who talk about education transformation. And we need that conversation about sort of massive, epic change. My approach is much more, I'm a tweaker. So I will try and look at systems and say, okay, where are little places or organizations, where are little places we can make a big difference, where it's not going to feel painful, where it's going to feel uncomfortable, and then you can sort of move through the pain. We were talking about it this morning with the team about how do you help leaders and teachers start thinking differently about how schools care. So we've done a little bit on sort of leadership and care. What I think is interesting is possibly finding strategies to work with leaders, not to say you have to care this way, but to say, how do you care now? And to be able to talk about it more widely in terms of sort of in your life, who is watching out for you? What does care look like in your normal life? Is there an ethic of care within your professional life, and where does it come from? And then on the basis of that, sort of almost like a starter activity, a dream, sort of checking in, then being able to say, okay, how have you systematized care in your building? Right? So within performance evaluations, within classroom observations, that's one way. But in terms of the nuanced things, is there one person in the school that knows someone else? So before the pandemic, I was doing a keynote just before the world shut down, and I had been reading what was happening in Italy and reading other places, and I kind of redid my keynote the morning of and said, we're going to have to focus this upside down. We're not going to talk about what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how well do your colleagues know you, and do they know when you're not okay? And we framed it sort of as a set of well-being tells. So if you're playing, I don't play poker, I would be horrible at it. But if you're playing poker, like, people can read your face, so you've got a poker face. And so what I tried to do is to translate that into the notion of a well-being tell. So I know there's things that happen to me when I'm not okay. So I will find like the pepper grinder in the fridge, or I will find the iron in the laundry basket. Now I don't iron anymore, so it's fine. But I know those things, but I had never actually explicitly shared them to anyone else. I lock myself out of the house, I do all these things, and I thought that morning, what would help me be well if we're going to get locked down? And it was understanding the signals that I'm burning out or I'm not okay, but making sure that there's another person I trust who can know them, and giving them permission then, if they see them, to stop me and say, okay, you need some care. And what I tried to do that morning in Ireland with the head teachers was to say, in your school at the moment, if you were to do this exercise on well-being tells, and I walked them through it, I said, how many people know you at school? And many of the leaders were like, not so many. And I said, but for your teachers, could opening the conversation up around well-being tells change the nature of how people feel about being at work, because they know that there's someone that they have given permission to be the person who watches out for them. So I don't think we can, wave a magic wand and say, everyone is going to care. But I think that there's ways that you can then demonstrate and highlight in the system. So there are going to be leaders and teachers and students who've worked on a model of being in their schools, that as researchers, one of the things that I'm helpful with is helping those leaders and teachers and students articulate what it is that it feels like and how did they get there, and then helping them to share their story with someone else, so that you might come from another school and say, I'm really interested, and then you can read a small story about how they came to that place and be inspired to take your own journey. So it's small steps. I think it's prioritizing what's most important, finding examples where we can share interesting practice or caring practice. And then finding ways to have conversations in schools where we're demonstrating and letting people practice what it feels like to, still be professional and still do an amazing job, but to be yourself while you're doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, because I was just thinking, if this is, and you articulated it beautifully, because it's actually about care, right? If you care enough, would you be able to demonstrate that in your immediate work, whether it is curriculum assessments, whether it is pedagogy, anything, right? But personally speaking, both as someone who works in the academics with the system, as well as a mother, how would you define success in the education system?
So, for me, it's that every student is having a chance to be successful, right? And success would be being happy, being kind, being developed, so that they have a chance to learn and they have a chance to grow. And we, the nerd community of the world and the policy community, know that in every country there are groups of students that are marginalized. And they're marginalized because they have one parent. They're marginalized because they come from a family that is poor. They come from a family where they don't have access to education. And success for me, for the system, would be one where every student has a fair chance to succeed, and that students who need extra support to succeed are able to access that. So when we were in London, there's competition for schools, and my son wanted to go to a state-funded school, as did I. And what was really interesting is that all of the parents, since he was born, pretty much, were asking me where I was going to send him to secondary school. And my response was, where he wants to go. And for most parents, that was shocking and irresponsible, that I would have actually let my child choose his school. But he came up with a set of criteria that were important to him. For him, being black, he wanted a head teacher that was black because he'd experienced great racism at primary school, and had wanted a school where the leader would have experienced that, him or herself, and they would put things in the school to protect him and others. And what was really interesting is that nowhere on that list was academic success. It was sports facilities. It was, did students look like they were interested? Did students talk nicely about their teachers? Did the teachers greet them nicely? What was the demographic composition? And I do not think I looked at, and this could get me fired probably, but I didn't look at the academic outcomes of any of the schools, partially because I trust that I can find my child the support to do well if he needs it, but also because I trust the school to treat everyone equally. And where I use my power often is if I feel like people are not being treated fairly, I will try and intervene, because it's just, and I have new skills now. Now that I've gone through security at the Bangalore airport, I have new skills at being able to throw my weight around. But I think success for me is that everyone has a chance to succeed, and that is both in terms of personhood and academics.
Yeah. And it's wonderful, because I always say this: the young always know.
Yeah.
Right, your son knows. I mean, look at the parameters that he chose for his own, right? I mean, and I don't know what we do or what the system does, that they end up changing, but they already are kind. Yeah. They already know what success is all about. Yeah. They know, I mean, that's a perfect list, right? Yeah. What he's talking about, respect, and he's talking about sports facilities, which is about teamwork. Yeah. It's awesome. He already knows what he wants.
It's about football. It's about Arsenal, not Man U, which a lot of Man U fans dream a dream.
Yeah. And I think, and that's what, this conversation is all about, because we're trying to see if, can we match the definition of success that's already existing among young people as people from the ecosystem. So thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
And I hope that you come back and we have this huge opportunity to host you again.
I would love to. Thank you.